Tanya, I've explained we're having Attorney General candidates to talk to us in the neighborhood, and you are one of the two candidates. So I want to give a little quick background on her. You have a law degree from Case Western Reserve. You have been in Atlanta as an assistant district attorney and maybe a supervising attorney.
Mhm.
And you also had experience with a large law firm. And then you went to the legislature, so you've been there for 2 terms and you've been elected to the chair of the Democratic caucus. Is that all
Yeah,
correct?
that is all correct.
Are there other things about you that you would want the voters to know?
I would say just in terms of my background, I was a state and a federal prosecutor. So before I moved to Atlanta and got my job at the Fulton County DA's office, where I was a homicide prosecutor and a crimes against women and children prosecutor, I was a federal prosecutor in New York. I'm a mom who
Oh, I had that down as a note.
I'm a mom and I have two fur babies.
So, Tanya, the big question is why leave the legislature? Why do you want to be attorney general? I mean, that's the question, probably the first question that most people will have in their minds.
Yeah. So it's interesting, Paul. The same thing that pushed me to run for state office, ironically, was the same thing that pushed me to run for attorney general, just with a slight twist. I had before running sort of been just a student of politics, probably, paid attention more than the average person. I worked on campaigns, mostly judicial and prosecutor or solicitor campaigns, fundraise, things like that. And then in 2016, when Hillary lost and President Trump was first elected, there was this feeling amongst a lot of us, particularly a lot of lawyers, that, whatever we were doing in our democracy and our government to protect the rule of law, we should be doing more. That time, it was very clear that state houses were sort of ground zero for a lot of the attacks on rights that we all held very dear. And so there was an opening in my district and I ran in 2022. As far as how I got to running for attorney general, very similar. Mr. Trump has been obviously reelected and we've seen really just an unprecedented sort of onslaught of what I believe to be harmful actions by the federal government towards citizens and towards states. And when you look around, who is on the front lines of many of those battles, it's Democratic attorneys general. I just sort of been watching their work, whether it was on pushing back on SNAP, funding cuts, or recently the victory on tariffs in the Supreme Court, education funding, pushing back on ICE. All of these lawsuits really sort of show the extraordinary importance in this moment of attorneys general. And so weighing my experience and how I felt I could be most useful in this moment to protect Georgians, it felt like the right thing to do. And
So,
so here we are.
if elected, then you'll be the state's attorney. What part of the job do you think is the most important right now?
Twofold. The first is what I consider to be sort of public protection. Okay. And by public protection, I mean the responsibility to be the chief law enforcement officer for the state and what that leadership role requires, that power requires. And two, there is a consumer protection aspect to that job that is, I think, a muscle that is not as often flexed in the office as it could and should be. I am very excited about the opportunities to really do some good things for working families and consumers through the power of consumer protection. And then I guess lastly, protecting the rule of law and standing up for, ironically, what we are now calling states' rights and some of the really unprecedented overreach we're seeing coming from Washington, D.C. So I think those, for me, are the most important. It's a mistake to just be anti Trump or really just anti anything. You really have to have an affirmative vision for the job because it's so big, because there's are many things that you could choose to focus on. The office will, of course, run as it's supposed to run. It is big, it is complex with multiple, units who do a whole lot of work for the state. But in terms of my priorities, I think those would capture.
So how just sort of a continuation of that, I guess, is that the office been run by some Republicans for a long time, a governor that also is in the same party. So there are some complications. In other words, how would you say that you would be different from our previous attorney generals? And if you ended up with a Republican governor, which
Oof.
I sort of hope doesn't happen, but how will you deal with that? That the attorney general from one party and a governor from another?
I've sort of described the initial sort of shock I had when I first announced my run, how few people knew what the attorney general does. Like people just don't know what the job is about. They don't understand the power. They vaguely know that there's a such thing as an attorney general, but not much else. And I concluded that was a result of the fact that for years the attorney general's office has done so little for everyday working families. They have not seen that office showing up for them in meaningful ways like we have seen in other places, New York with Letitia James. So the first thing I think we have to do is shift our focus from being sort of the general counsel to the ruling political class, right? Which I think is one frame that you can view that office as, to being a public protection office for the people. So the attorney general was once at one point in time, and I'm getting to your second question, at one point in time was an appointed position. The governor got to appoint the attorney general. Many, many, many years ago, that changed. We started to elect our attorney general. And I think with that move to make the attorney general accountable in and of herself to the people as a constitutional officer requires you to really understand the power of the office and use it, have an independent vision for the office and your role. And so that is how I think I would be different. And if there happens to be a Republican governor and a Democratic AG, the first thing I would do, which I have learned from my years at the Capitol, is to try to find common ground. I think you go into these relationships or situations where you have to deal with bipartisanship and bipartisanism, and with an open mind, and hoping that there are things for which we will have common ground on and share as far as vision goes. However, when the inevitable split comes, just because we have such different ideas about policy, I think my job is to follow the law and the Constitution, and the things that I am able to do per the Constitution and per statutory authority, I will do. There will be moments where the governor can direct me to do something.
Yeah.
And per Constitution, I would have to endeavor to do that, but I would do that my way. I think that is clear. The governor can instruct on what to do, but he can instruct on how to do, and he cannot dictate results, and he cannot dictate litigation if that is where we are. So once that sort of permission slip gets signed, it is upon the attorney general to then do that thing according to his or her professional judgment. And so that might be where you see, the independence shine through.
And that would be true whether it's a Democratic or Republican governor.
Ultimately, the governor can say, look, I am directing the attorney general to investigate X or to explore filing this lawsuit for X reason. And the attorney general then can do those things. But the ultimate legal conclusion, the decisions about how to do that belong really to the attorney general. And so ideally, it is a relationship that works cooperatively. But if that breaks down, each role has its own independent requirement to exercise their best judgment, particularly for the attorney general, which is really unique because you're a professional. You have bar obligations. You're a lawyer. You're a licensed lawyer. Let's say, for example, the Surgeon General, which is very different than the Attorney General, but just conceptually, there are doctors who have these symbolic roles in our society, But the president can't tell the doctors how to practice medicine. They can't tell the doctors what medical opinions they can or should have. And I think the attorney general, although different because it's a different kind of real role, that concept is the same.
Yeah, he does control your budget too, so he has some tools. That
Well, the legislature actually, well, it's a combination, right? The governor, the budgeting process is a collaborative effort between the governor and the General Assembly. And so, as our government should operate, there are checks and balances and folks who have to sort of work together to make budgetary decisions for the state.
you mentioned investigations, and I wondered whether maybe you see any things in our political system and the local system that maybe need more investigation than they've had in the past. Do you have any investigations in mind?
I hear all the time on the campaign trail about, cases, legal matters that have happened in various places across the state that have left the community feeling unsettled or like justice has not been done. Each of those would really, although I'm very intrigued by those, I'm very interested in hearing about things that feel like injustices to the community. You really have to take those things as they come on a factual basis because there's so many questions, whether you have jurisdiction, whether there's a statute of limitations issue, all of these sort of things, whether there's double jeopardy issue because someone has been held accountable and maybe not to the extent the community wants and just having to walk through those things. So I am definitely open to hearing that. We talk often in Atlanta about the Atlanta child murders. I know two extraordinary APD homicide detectives who I've worked with when I was a prosecutor who are quite passionate about that case and feel like there is a good bit more investigation that could and should be done.
In your experience as an attorney, are there any particular cases that stand out for you that you were involved in that you were particularly passionate about, you were pleased with to be involved, that really stand out?
As a homicide prosecutor, some of the hardest cases, and we were literally just talking about this because we were debating a gun silencer bill that was on the floor last week or the week before, where Republicans were trying to loosen the restrictions to some extent on gun silencers, which are heavily regulated at the federal level. And I was talking about it sort of required me to talk a little bit about my work as a homicide prosecutor. And some of the toughest cases were cases that involved children, that just really, really, really hard cases. And they were emotionally challenging for everybody involved, including the juries that sat on them, the families that went through it, and the cops and the DAs that worked them. But they also were some of the most rewarding because I think for a lot of folks, closure is like a myth when you've lost someone violently that way. For a lot of families, it's just a wound that never heals, but they can't even start until there has been some semblance of justice as it relates to the cause, the person who took their loved one away. And so it does feel good extraordinarily to help families, begin the process of moving on and healing by participating in that. So those are some of the ones I think that stand out.
Mhm. Are there any particular pieces of legislation that you got involved in that either passed or didn't pass or, where you were passionate about passing but didn't get through the hierarchy of the General Assembly?
So much
And so
legislation, Paul. So much legislation. So many wonderful legislative ideas. Obviously, my colleagues and I have been pushing healthcare for a long, 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 long time. Democrats, for at least the better part of over a decade, every year, urged the General Assembly to expand access to healthcare, to expand Medicaid, to come up with more affordable ways for our citizens to access healthcare. That has been a passion fight for Democrats down there for a long time. It remained a passion fight, even remains now, even to this day, when we are really about to go over a cliff with our healthcare system and the ACA subsidies set to expire. I think sticking with that work and always having, as Democrats, a heart for knowing how important healthcare is. It wasn't always the sexiest issue. Oftentimes, culture war issues were pushed to the forefront and got the most attention. But the dedication that Democrats have had to this issue of healthcare and how important their expertise is on this issue in this moment, as we are about to go into a healthcare crisis, I think is a point of pride for me. I'm a big proponent of insurance reform, and I had a bill that would have placed a consumer advocate within the insurance commissioner's office, whose job it would have been to advocate for consumers anytime an insurance company, health, property, house, car wanted to increase their rate, instead of it just being a conversation between the industry and the insurance commissioner. The consumer advocate would enter into that conversation and have access to data and to everything that the insurance commissioner really was considering, could subpoena, could go to court. They got a hearing, but that's as far as it went. We put a lot of work into that bill.
So a quick thing that interests me is the Attorney General does advise all the different departments of the state about what the law is. So maybe there's some role, it may be in healthcare. Would there be some things that your office might be advising the community health people about?
There might be lots of things, questions about certificates of need, all kinds of transactional questions about hospitals opening, hospitals closing, funding and programs that are run through the Department of Community Health, whether they're compliant. So there are tons of ways that the AG can, I think, weigh in. But the AG, unfortunately, can't change the law. The legislature has to do that. And I think that is probably the single biggest thing that we can do to alleviate the pressure of the uninsured in the state of Georgia.
Well, let me ask my last question, and it's one I think Democrats probably have in their mind is if they want to win in November, they got to have the best candidate. So what's your strategy for winning in November? What makes
Yeah.
you a good candidate to win there as opposed to Bob Trammell?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it is always a question of a base plus. So whoever the nominee is has to be able to excite the base and then also appeal to independents. We saw Raphael Warnock do this. We are all familiar with sort of the infamous Kemp Warnock votes, right? Folks who supported Brian Kemp, but also Raphael Warnock. And it is a similar dynamic, but every election ethos is different. So we need someone who can excite the base, and we need someone to appeal to independents. We know that independents tend to like prosecutors in these roles. Like that tends to be a preference for them. And I think my experience as both a federal and state prosecutor, as a civil rights lawyer, as a lawyer who has taken on, a lot of these folks involved in the affordability discussion, whether it's, landlords representing families when landlords are not doing what they're supposed to do, suing insurance companies for cheating families out of what they paid for. There is just a cocktail of experience that speaks to this moment more than anything else. I feel like that is what sets me apart from all the folks in this race with me. We're going to continue on our message. It's an inclusive one. It is not partisan, hyper partisan. I've run my campaign through a primary, really focused on a message that would appeal to independents and disaffected Republicans. And that is, you don't want necessarily someone screaming, I'll be the one to fight Trump, even though, I think it's clear based on my record, I will fight anybody when it comes to the people and protecting the people and, of course, protecting the rule of law and the right to vote. But you have to have an affirmative message, and it has to appeal to a wide audience. And we think we have that. We have received a ton of support because of that. And we feel pretty confident about our chances in this primary and in the general.
Do you have a last quick comment that you haven't had a chance to make yet?
I think this is an extraordinary time. I know that folks are nervous and anxious and afraid. But for me, I think it is a time of great opportunity. And so I just want all of your listeners to lean into that. It's okay to feel it, but it's just not okay for us to be paralyzed by it. We got to fight. Everything we've ever gotten is because we stood up for it in this country. It's the most American thing to do. And I look forward to being in that fight with the people. I can't do it without them. And I look forward to standing next to them as we take this state back and take our country back.
Well, Tanya, I thank you for your time, and I'm hoping lots of people have a chance to hear you and keep up the hard work.
Thank you for having me.